Okay, we're back, and our next issue that we're going to cover in our core course deals with advertising. Now, there's been a number of advertising changes that have taken place over the course of the last 10, 15 years, and a lot of that is due to the use of the internet to market properties and market our services. So we're going to get into that a little more detail a little later on because Chris Reed and I have done a video on that. But the first thing I want you to do so that we have just a little bit of an understanding of where we're at is we have an advertising quiz, and I want you to go ahead and take that advertising quiz. And then we'll come back and we'll go over that one as well. So please take the advertising quiz.
Please pause the video. Return to your coursework and go to the advertising module and take the advertising quiz. Once you've submitted your quiz, return to the advertising video guide.
All right, let's go over a short advertising quiz now that you've just completed. And we'll get started in our first question. William manages Always Sold. He also lists and sells. Is he required to disclose that he is the managing broker on his advertising? And the correct answer is B, yes, except on yard signs. There is an exception for yard signs, but that is the only exception. So he would have to put it on any like paper advertising, on the internet, even on his business card. Okay? Question number 2. Susan is a new agent with no listings. She is urging her brokerage company listings and, she is using her brokerage company's listings in social media. She wants to use other brokerage company listings as well. Is this okay? And the correct answer would be her brokerage listings are allowed, and she must have permission and give attribution to be able to use other brokers' listings. Now this kind of ties in with our IDX policies and things that certain MLSs have. Some MLSs may grant that authority, but I think what we're talking about here is specific, which usually deals just with websites, whereas this is a social media situation. So I believe what I have seen most currently used or most normally used, she would have to get the permission of each one of those other brokerage firms to be able to display their listings, and then of course give them attribution if you were like using Facebook or that type of advertising platform. Question number 3. John offers virtual tours and virtual staging for vacant properties on his website. Which of the following would be allowed when virtually staging a home? So the correct answer would be to add furniture to such as the living room. In other words, if you had a vacant property and you wanted to be able to say this is what it would look like with furniture, you could add some furniture to that virtual staging of a vacant home. However, adding a fireplace, obviously that is a fixture that they would expect to be there, and of course when you add that virtually, it's not there, so that would be false and misleading. The other thing, removing power lines and water tower, if it were in the background or something like that, once again, that would be changing something and make it false and misleading. Whereas if you're just adding living room furniture, you're showing what it would look like with furniture. The last one, repairing cracks in the drywall, unless they were in fact corrected and repaired, then no. Okay? So it all ties back into false and misleading advertising. And that's our advertising quiz. Thank you.
Now that we've taken our little advertising quiz, I hope you did okay on that, and we've talked about the correct answers for that. And now I want you to go and watch a video that Chris Reed and myself put together about some of the changes that are just currently now in effect. Some of them will be further defined by rule next year, but in 2020. But I think currently we're in pretty good shape, and we're going to give you some of the more nuanced and detailed things covered in that video with Chris and I talking about advertising. Chris, let's talk just a little bit about the changes in the law that passed in the amendment here in 2019 as it pertains to advertising. And the first one, of course, I think we need to lead that off with is now we do have a definition of teams in the license law, in the Act. And you want to talk a little bit about how they define the teams?
Sure, I'd love to. And keep in mind, this is happening across the country, that different states are addressing teams in their legislative process. Illinois is not the only one that is doing that. It's even been hard to define what makes a team because there's different definitions. Well, now we have a definition in the License Act. It says that a team is going to consist of a minimum of 2 licensees. So if I am an individual licensee and I have an assistant, I can't put myself out there as Chris Reed team. I'm not 2 licensed individuals. So
in other words, your assistant was an unlicensed
assistant,
okay.
right? Because that would be deceiving to the public. And the legislators said, hey, we want to make sure it's 2 licensees. So we have a definite definition of what makes a team, a minimum of 2 licensees.
And of course, they would have to be working for the same sponsoring broker.
Correct.
And be managed by the same managing broker. That's also within that definition, I believe.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Good.
So that clarifies that it has to be in 2 or more licensees working for the same sponsoring broker and working under the same managing broker that is designated, and they are operating as a unit. So, okay, at least 2 or more. Along with that, I think what they did was they came up with some advertising guidelines for teams, because as you know, before the amendment, the word team was never even mentioned in our license law.
Right.
And so now we do have not only the definition, but as it pertains to advertising. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, and that has to do with what is the team name. Let's go back again. What is the purpose of license law? Is to protect the consumers.
Sure.
And some of these and advertising has always said there should not be anything misleading to the public. And there have been some names that some teams have branded themselves with that you can't tell if it's a brokerage company or if it's a team. So our act has now been amended, and there are some specific names, words. Team names may not contain any inherently misleading items such as, so at a minimum, the names are company.
But they're not all inclusive either.
Right,
Because
correct.
as we know, these teams come up with different ideas all the time.
Right.
So, yeah.
So, but the words that are absolutely spelled out is company, realty, real estate, agency, associates, brokers, properties, property. So any team name that has any of those words in there. Now, needs to change. Now, what we don't know, the rules that are going to be written by committee that are going to be passed will spell out a transition time or whatever, because we recognize, and everybody thinks of, oh my gosh, I've got 50 signs with the name, I've been branded as the Chris Reed Realty Group.
Right.
All right, is that going to be a problem? And yes, it is going to be a problem. I need to rebrand myself.
Right.
So the time frame of that change is what's going to be itemized in the rules when they're written.
And it'll be interesting because, like I said, and you know even more than I, they're very, very, these teams have been very imaginative in how they come up to make it look like they are their own sole entity without
being attached to a company. They want to create that, which, as you said, that is misleading or inherently, I think what was the phrase they always used to use, likely to deceive the public. And
Correct.
so we always have to look at that. But I think it's interesting that we are now addressing those issues. And so that's interesting.
Now, the size has also changed too.
For
Norm,
the
why don't you-
disclosure,
why
the
don't you explain that?
disclosure, many years ago, when I first got into the regulatory part of this, used to be that the sponsoring broker's name had to be larger than that of the sponsored licensee. Well, then we removed that. You still had to disclose the sponsoring broker's name, but once again, it ended up that it was in very, 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 very fine print down at the end of an ad or on a web page or whatever. So they went back, and it doesn't have to be larger, but it does say that the sponsored licensee's name cannot be larger than the sponsoring broker. So it can be equal to, but it can't be larger.
And
So
that goes with team names. So the
team names
logo.
or even individual licensees
Right,
is the
right,
same thing.
right.
So sponsored licensees. So I think how we work out through all of this, Chris, because I know you've been involved on the regulatory side as well. You try new things to maybe open things up, and then you have to pull it back. And this is one of those situations where size does make a difference, and they want to make sure that, because the intent of the license law, because of the structure of our license law, is that the sponsoring broker, by and through their designated managing broker, is responsible for all these activities that these sponsored licensees provide when they provide services. So we're kind of pulling that back a little bit, and I think it's a good thing, because it's like anything else.
Well, the word before, I mean, this isn't a major change, because the word before was the sponsoring broker's name had to be readily apparent.
Right.
But what was, there was a different definition from different people of readily
Absolutely.
apparent.
And-
So therefore, that's why they said exactly it has to be
Yeah.
the same or larger. The sponsoring broker's name has to be the same or larger.
It's
Now, there's already been 100 different examples. Well, how about this? How about this? And every time the question has been posed to the department, they say, well, we'll take a note of that, and that we'll address that in the rules. Like I showed one time a proof of a logo, and this was an individual name. The logo itself of the sponsoring broker was bigger than the individual's name, but the actual printing of the sponsoring broker's name was smaller than the individual name.
Okay.
And so I handed this to the director and the assistant director, and they said, "Thank you. We'll take that into advisement." So we don't know the rules on that
Exactly
type of
how
thing.
it's going to play out, but
Point
generally,
being, yeah, make it larger now.
yeah, there you go, or at least the same size.
Right.
The other thing that is kind of a change in the advertising part of the real estate law, previously, if you had a web page, whether it be on Facebook, Twitter, email, anything, you had to have the name of the licensee, the name of the sponsoring broker, a general office location of that sponsoring broker, and also if you were advertising actually listings, you had to have a general geographic location of that listing. Well, and that had to be under the law before the amendments, that had to be on every page, no matter. So, of course, this was hard for some people to work out on some of these social media sites and things like that. And actually, the Code of Ethics for the National Association of Realtors allowed for a, if you wanted to call it a link or a one click to where all of that information was displayed. So you want to talk about that? Basically, our license law now matches what was
Right.
in the code, because the license law was more restrictive than the code, and there was a lot of
I have to
confusion.
tell you that the original intent when the professional standards of NAR changed that in the code, the intent was more for Twitter, where there is limited space, where they allowed the click-through. It was never intended for Facebook because you don't have limited space there. But of course, give an inch and they'll take a mile. And it was very difficult to explain this to people that, hey, the code has this, but our license law, it doesn't matter. We had no click-through.
Right.
Now with this change, it is going to mirror what the Code of Ethics say.
Yeah. So I think that's a good positive change, so there's no confusion now.
And again, the whole thing on advertising, the whole purpose, go back to the purpose of license law, is the protection of the consumer. Who is the brokerage company that oversees the supervision of the individual, the team, or whatever? And that needs to be totally open and clear to the public.
Yep. I think that's a good way to put it. I think that's all we have. So,
Okay.
good.
You can now close the advertising video guide. Return to your coursework to go to the Disclosures module, read the 2 pages on disclosures. Then you will open and play the Disclosures video guide.